In my second lecture for this unit, I talked at length about El Greco, but I didn't really address 16th century Spain. In geopolitical terms, the 1500s was Spain's golden age. Spain had evicted the Moors, conquered much of the New World, and spent its newfound wealth building magnificent monuments and fighting Protestants all over Europe. In the end, the gold from the New World brought runaway inflation, and the religious wars depleted Spain's treasury without obliterating Protestantism or even preserving Spanish rule over the Protestant Netherlands. Rather ironically, it was the 17th century, that is the 1600s, the years of decline, that would bring the greatest flowering of Spanish painting, and that's where I'm heading now. But first, I wanted you to see Philip II's great palace, actually a combined palace and monastery. This is the image from your textbook, and it makes the Renaissance features clearer. What are they? Well, remember that Renaissance means classical and also elegantly simple. So note the dome, the attached columns, and the Greek-style pediments. Perhaps ironically, it was the long reign of Philip II's grandson, Philip IV, and a period, again, when Spain's wealth and power declined that saw really the apogee of Spanish art. Philip IV's court painter, and among the great painters of the Baroque era, was Diego Velazquez. Velazquez did the best he could with some rather unpromising material. Philip IV had a particularly exaggerated form of the famous Habsburg chin. Basically, the painter decides to steal our attention away from that unfortunate face and to emphasize the king's power and authority by what? Well, mostly by painting his elegant clothing in superb detail. Here's an early work by Velazquez. So, whose influence do you see? I warned you about this in my last lecture. The answer to that question, so often asked by the College Board, so often is going to turn out to be Caravaggio. And I hope after my Caravaggio blitz you can see the resemblance. So, test, what Caravaggio elements can you identify? Well, there's the pronounced chiaroscuro. There's that open construction. Remember, what does open construction mean? It means that the scene spills out of the canvas, that there aren't clear boundaries, that it invades our space. There's the choice of a scene involving ordinary people and an event of everyday life. Although, as we just saw, Velazquez's subject will more often be the royal family or Spanish nobility. So how does Velazquez's painting style differ from Caravaggio's, even this early in his career? Well, the tenebrism is much less pronounced, and the gradations between light and dark are more subtle. We're going to see this with Rubens as well in just a few minutes. Here's another famous work by Velazquez that does not appear in your book. Again, the Caravaggio influence is obvious. In fact, I think Velazquez's Bacchus bears a startling resemblance to some of Caravaggio's young boys. We see, again, the more gradated chiaroscuro with dramatic light focused on Bacchus. We see the open composition as the painting moves to the edges of its frame and beyond. Do you see any resemblances to Caravaggio in theme? Well, this is a mythological and not a biblical scene. Caravaggio does biblical scenes. But it does seem to me that here again we have the world of the gods dropping down into the lives of ordinary people. But there's a little mystery here. Is Bacchus really there? Or are these revelers so inebriated that they think one of their fellow partiers is really a god? Velazquez loves to play with ambiguities, as we'll see in a moment when we get to Las Meninas. Here's a close-up. Look at these wonderfully evocative peasant faces. We're going to see a very similar portrait style when we get to the Dutch Baroque portraitist Frans Hals, who is also a College Board favorite. Here's still another Velazquez painting of a scene from classical antiquity. Note the highly dramatic spotlighting. By the way, the adjective dramatic and the comparison to use in theater of a spotlight will always come in handy in an essay on Baroque art. Here we move from a quasi-genre scene to the formal paintings of the nobility that became Velazquez's trademark and paid his bills. This painting commemorates a Spanish victory over the Dutch. And to fast forward to my next lecture, I should note that the Dutch win out in the end and managed to gain their independence from Spain. Note that the Spanish general is portrayed as behaving generously toward his opponent. The Spanish nobility was fiercely Catholic and fiercely proud, and this painting captures the way Velazquez's patron wanted to view his reign. The Dutch would have disagreed. The 80-year Spanish wars in the Netherlands were cruel, even by the standards of this age of religious wars. This, by the way, was Spain's last great military success. The Dutch won it back just a few years later. Note finally the splendidly foreshortened horse in the right foreground. Equestrian portraits will become more popular in this era, and it's a chance to show off technical skill. Okay, this is one of the most famous paintings in art history. I was rather startled to discover that it does not show up in any of the image-based questions from the last 16 years. Before you decide you can now tune out and not pay attention, let me just say that makes it way overdue. It would not surprise me at all if it showed up on your test this May. So, where is the light coming from in this painting? Look toward the middle of the painting on the right. The figure you see in the doorway is actually the Prime Minister of Spain, which means he was Velazquez's paymaster. He is opening the door to let in the light, so it's a kind of indirect compliment. Now, I really hope you watch the Khan Academy podcast on this very important painting, because I'm going to have to skip over it too quickly. Let me just note it's a more mysterious painting than it appears at first glance. Art historians still debate about what's really going on here. Are the king and queen watching Velazquez, painting at his own easel, paint their daughter? Is the princess looking out at her parents, reflected to us in the mirror, or is she looking at us? Note, by the way, the shout-out to Van Eyck's Arnolfini marriage in the use of the mirror. Here are a couple of details from the painting. We see Velazquez wearing the mark of nobility that, interestingly, he has not yet managed to attain. He wants it very much. Nobility is everything in Spain at that point, and Velazquez does not come from a noble background. That would be a nice detail to remember, by the way, if you chose this for a self-portrait essay. And the couple in the mirror are clearly the king and queen. That chin is a dead giveaway, and you probably notice the resemblance. But are they included to make this a more complete family portrait? To suggest that Velazquez is almost a member of the royal family, privy to their most intimate moments? The little princess is clearly the painting's central figure. Note she's bathed again in that almost theatrical spotlight. I think it's her dwarf maid of honor who is the emotional center of the painting. Velazquez imbues her face with enormous dignity. This is a woman who has not let deformity defeat her. So what do you notice about the brush strokes? Look especially at the little princess's sleeves. These brushstrokes are broad and easily visible. Art historians use the term loose to describe this kind of brushstroke, as opposed to tight brushstrokes where you can barely identify the brushstroke. So Van Eyck would be an example of a tight brushstroke. This term, hint, hint, will show up on your unit test. That is the term loose brushstroke, often associated with the Baroque. The paint is actually laid on quite thickly in a technique known as impasto. Basically, it refers to paint applied so thickly that brush and palette knives are evident. It is especially characteristic of Dutch Baroque painting, which we will see in the next lecture. It seems to me when I did this last year, I discovered that this term did not show up in your book. Maybe I'm wrong. It's a term that's important in art history and would be a good one for you to use anyway. Now, Zurbarán was a contemporary of Velázquez and is best known for his portraits and religious paintings. This painting is typical of Zurbarán's style. It reflects an austere Catholic piety, deep contrasts of light and dark, and sharp edges and line. Note that it does not use impasto or blurred lines. This saint preached to the Muslims, which was pretty much a guaranteed pursuit of martyrdom. Here's another of Zurbarán's paintings, again exhibiting the sharp lines and chiaroscuro, but at the same time with a much more dramatic use of color. This painting is the Martyrdom of St. Bartholomew by Giuseppe de Ribera, who's actually one of my favorite Spanish painters. Ribera painted in much the same tense, dramatic, tenebrous style as Zurbarán, but he uses slightly softer lines. So what Baroque features do you see? Well, there are the twisted figures. There's the dramatic use of light and dark, or chiaroscuro. There's the emphasis on a saint. Now, why do I say that's typical of some parts of the Baroque? It's part of the Counter-Reformation, which is doubling down on Catholic doctrine, and particularly the veneration of saints. We also see the intentional foreshortening of figures that move out into our space, or the open composition. The contrast between the dark, grim scene at the bottom of the painting and the vibrant blue sky also suggests a theological message. After suffering will come redemption. Well, I haven't made much secret of my enthusiasm for Caravaggio, and now I'm going to confess that I am less excited by Rubens, for much the same reason I find Baroque ceilings a bit too much. It seems over the top, but I am going to try to get over it because Rubens is a very important painter. Rubens trained in Italy, and the influence of the High Renaissance, and particularly the color and light of what High Renaissance painting? Venetian painting is very strong, particularly in his earlier works. Rubens returned to his home of Antwerp in what was the southern Netherlands or Flanders, which remained more Catholic, and worked for the daughter of Philip II of Spain. The Elevation of the Cross was one of Rubens' first important paintings, and it still shows the Italian influence. Note, though, the strong diagonals of the composition, trending down in the center, and then up into the right panel. Note, too, the way Rubens has made the scene continuous across the triptych, which was not typical of triptychs. The figure on the bottom left, a typically Rubenesque full-figured woman, draws the viewer into the painting, and so does the foreshortening of the horse and the figure pulling up the cross. This is another example of what kind of composition? Open composition. The huge muscular bodies echo what Italian painter? Michelangelo. What do you notice about light and color? Light is used dramatically to spotlight the action, but we see less tenebrism and more of that brilliant, even optimistic color that Rubens would have learned from the Venetian painters. Rubens is a much less gloomy painter than Caravaggio or the Spanish painters we just examined. Note, by the way, the similarity of the torso to the hero from our old friend from Hellenistic Greece. Rubens, like most painters of the Italian Renaissance and the Baroque eras, frequently sketched from classical models. Now, I've mentioned this before, but there are a lot of parallels between Baroque and Hellenistic art. Drama, movement, twisting figures, portrayal of human bodies under extreme duress. I did not assign the Khan Academy lecture on this work. It's long and very, very good. I didn't assign it because I wanted you to see it in class. So rather than leave it to homework chance, I'm going to have you watch it now. Lots of things to take notes on here. I'm not sure that I put a space for this in your notes template, but you should take notes anyway. The section of the Low Countries remained under Spanish Habsburg rule and remained loyal to the Catholic Church. Rubens was not only a court painter, he was also a diplomat, so he had an opportunity to witness the horrors of the wars of religion firsthand. I really hope you did watch the excellent Khan Academy podcast on this work. Note that I picked the shorter one for your homework. Let me just note that this is another very important painting that has not shown up in AP image-based questions for more than a decade. So that makes it a logical candidate for showing up this year and a work you should know. So this painting is filled with allegory. What does that term mean? Well, here's one dictionary definition: a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political meaning. More simply, one figure standing in for another. So what allegorical figures do we see here? Well, on the left, there's Europe flinging her arms up in despair over the war that is engulfing her. We see Alecto, the Fury, holding the torch with an almost mad face. And below, what are the figures being trampled? Well, they're allegorical representations of the arts. And Rubens, an artist, sees the destruction that war creates in culture. Basically, it destroys resources, can actually destroy works of art. Remember, iconoclasm is sweeping through Protestantism, and works of art are actually being destroyed. So, what are some Baroque elements you see? Well, there's that extreme sense of movement, the twisted figures, the dramatic but because it's Rubens, rather light use of color, sometimes described as coloristic. The full-figured lady is very typical of Rubens. The use of mythological symbols. Rubens basically is one of those painters whose works you should be able to identify by sight, even if a work goes unlabeled and even if you haven't seen it before. This painting, by the way, is darker in both theme and color than most of Rubens' paintings, but his style is still unmistakable. Well, this one does show up in the AP test, and you're going to be hearing from one of your classmates about this work. This is one of a cycle of 24 paintings commissioned by Marie de Medici, the Queen of France and regent for her young son, Louis XIII. She was fighting for control of France, a fight, by the way, she lost to Cardinal Richelieu and ultimately to her son, who banished her from France when he came of age. These paintings were designed not only to celebrate her reign, but to bolster her rather precarious political position. Since she wasn't really as important as she wanted to have herself portrayed, Rubens had to stretch, mostly by filling up the paintings with lots of mythological figures intended to indicate her importance and favor with the gods. In this painting, Marie de Medici is arriving in France from Italy. A personified France appears to be kneeling before her, knows the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France. Below her, we see 3 sea nymphs and the god of the sea celebrating her arrival, holding the ship steady so that she can disembark safely. By the way, there's a Khan Academy podcast on this work that I didn't assign, and I'm not having you watch now. But again, this work will be on your test, so you might think about watching it as you prepare for the, again, 94 image-based questions that we will be throwing at you from previous AP exams. The podcast has a particularly good discussion of Rubens' masterful use of brush strokes to capture reflection and motion. Anthony van Dyck trained under Rubens, you can see the influence, and he followed him into royal service. Charles I was a king of England, and he was best known for getting his head chopped off during the English Civil War. The artist knows who's paying his bills, so we see a regal stance, a somewhat arrogant, though not unfriendly face. And by the way, looking right at the viewer, I am the king. Remember, Henry VIII also directly gazes at the viewer. We see a kingdom stretched out behind him, and there's a low horizon line, which really puts the emphasis on the king who towers over the land that he rules. Van Dyck will have a major influence on English portraiture, and we'll see more of those portraits in Unit 11. We're also going to see a lot more still lifes in the lecture on Dutch painting still to come. But Clara Peters is a female Flemish artist, and of course the College Board loves female artists. These still lifes of food and flowers together were known as breakfast pieces, and they were very popular with the rising middle class. But note that chiaroscuro shows up even in this very domestic scene. And we'll see even more of that when we move on, as we will, to Dutch painting.